the fact that probably most of us in this room today weren't born vegan shows that whilst we do live in a world that is not necessarily favorable to veganism as it currently is, it also shows that we as a species have the power to change, and we have the power to challenge ourselves in ways that lead us to doing things differently, things that maybe go against what is normal in amongst most societies, things that go against maybe the way that our family raised us or our friends live. We're shifting things millimeter by millimeter. That might not seem like a lot, and of course, we would wish it to be more. But even that small shift over time creates a different world around us.
Είμαστε έτοιμοι να ξεκινήσουμε. Ο καλεσμένος μας διευθυντής, όπως θα ξέρετε ήδη, είναι ο Ed, είναι ο Earthling Ed, Edwinters. Λίγοι άνθρωποι δεν χρειάζονται σύσταση με τον τρόπο που ο Ed δεν χρειάζεται σύσταση. Γνωστός τόσο μέσα από το YouTube κανάλι του και μέσω όλων των ακτιβιστικών δράσεων που κάνει. Τον ξέρετε, φαντάζομαι, γι' αυτό έχετε δώσει και ώρες εδώ. Χωρίς παραπάνω καθυστέρηση, δίνω την πάσα να ακούσουμε τι έχει να μας πει.
Thank you so much for having me. And I just want to say a huge thank you to the organizers for inviting me along to speak with you for the next hour or so. I think it is next 45 minutes or so. I'm really looking forward to it. And to kind of break it down, I'm going to be talking to you for around about 20 to 30 minutes or so. And then what will happen is we'll open it up to a kind of Q&A. So if there are any questions that you have for me, then hold on to them and we'll try and get through as many of them as we possibly can when we get to that point of this particular session today. So I'm going to talk to you about a few different things, but it's all going to be kind of related to, I suppose, experiences that I've had. And ultimately, I think the journey that I've been on in my own life in terms of going vegan. And then I suppose some of the things that I've encountered since becoming vegan that I think are actually quite interesting and hopefully can encourage us to be better and more effective when it comes to talking about our views and explaining veganism and helping people understand why we are vegan and why we go to vegan festivals and why we care about this issue. And I think that it's always great to start off right at the beginning, which is from the beginning of my life, in essence, because like probably most of you in this room today, I wasn't born vegan and my family still aren't vegan. And so I was raised in an environment where I was eating meat, dairy, eggs every single day, multiple times a day. And it was this normal thing for me, like it probably was for so many of you in this room today. And it was something that was so ingrained that I never really questioned it. I never really thought about why on earth it is that I would ever want to change how I was eating and how I was living. And doesn't that just speak volumes about, I suppose, the challenge that we have in front of us, which is that we're dealing with something or challenging something that is the dominant mindset. You know, it's the biggest or one of the most socially ingrained behaviors that we as a global society or citizenship engage in. It's something that culturally most cultures are aligned with, that almost every nation, groups within these nations partake in every single day. And what's always really interesting is people will always say things, well, like in my culture, we eat a lot of meat, dairy, and eggs. And the sad thing is it's the same in every culture. And that just speaks volumes to, I suppose, the challenge that we have in front of us, because we are attempting to overturn or attempting to challenge something which the whole world over is so deeply ingrained and normalized and partaken in. And I think that speaks volumes to the challenge that we have. But I suppose the flip side to that is the fact that probably most of us in this room today weren't born vegan shows that whilst we do live in a world that is not necessarily favorable to veganism as it currently is, it also shows that we as a species have the power to change. And we have the power to challenge ourselves in ways that lead us to doing things differently, things that maybe go against what is normal in amongst most societies, things that go against maybe the way that our family raised us or our friends live. And I think that speaks to something empowering and positive, which is the idea that we can do things differently and that we can actually do things that go against what it is that we've been raised to do. And that's exactly what I did. When I got to about 20 years old, I came across this story. And this story was about a truck carrying about 6,500 chickens and the truck had crashed on the way to a slaughterhouse in England. In fact, it was near a city called Manchester, which is in northern England. And I was reading this story online and feeling really upset for these chickens. And it's a funny thing to feel upset for an animal who you've never really thought about once before in your life, because you learn so much about yourself when you empathize with others. Our ability to empathize and understand and, I suppose, recognize that suffering that others are forced to endure is a really powerful motivator in encouraging us to change and in encouraging us to challenge ourselves. And that moment reading about this story of these 6,500 chickens who've been involved in this crash, hundreds of whom had died, hundreds more of whom were suffering and had broken bones and broken wings and deformities and were mutilated. And reading this story encouraged me to think about my actions in a critical way. Because until that point, I had loved KFC. Fried chicken was my favorite food, and medium rare steak was my second favorite food. And the thing that was uncomfortable for me in that moment was that reading this story online reminded me that in my fridge was a leftover KFC, a leftover fried chicken meal. And so I entered into this weird state, I suppose, where I'm feeling sorry for chickens, but recognizing that in my fridge are the reason why chickens go to slaughterhouses. It's the food. And now the reason why chickens are suffering. And that word suffering became really important to me, because how often do we, or had we, until the moment where we realized what we were partaking in, how often had we actually seriously considered what it is or what it was that we were paying for? Now, obviously, veganism and the way that we currently produce food has a huge impact on the environment, right? There's no denying that. The United Nations and the IPCC reports commissioned by the United Nations confirm what it is that we are hearing all the time from the most respected scientific and environmental organizations in the world. They are reaffirming to us that our food system has a serious issue, or is a serious issue, on our environment. And if we don't change how we farm and change how we eat, well, then we will inevitably end up in a much worse situation than the one that we are currently in. And so from an environmental perspective, there's a very selfish reason why we need to challenge our food choices. Because if we don't, well, we as humans will feel the consequences, the problems, the damage that will be caused if we continue producing food and eating the same food that we currently are. I mean, we know that animal farming is one of the biggest contributors to greenhouse gas emissions. And we know that animal farming is the biggest user of land globally and is the biggest contributor to habitat loss and species extinction and rainforest deforestation, and even things like water pollution and soil erosion, and all of these concerning and pressing issues. And so we know that we have to change from a selfish perspective. But I think what veganism needs to be recognized as, and of course ultimately is a movement that is fundamentally trying to understand, recognize, respect even, that non-human animals like us human animals deserve moral consideration. And as a consequence of deserving moral consideration, deserve basic rights. The right to a life free from exploitation, the right to their own bodies, their autonomy, the right to not be killed by us, the right not to be harmed by us. Veganism fundamentally, whilst it has hugely positive benefits for all of us as humans, is about providing benefits to non-human animals as well, and basic ones at that. The right to not be put in these situations that we currently force them into. And so I'm reading this chicken story crash, this chicken truck crashing, reading all about that, thinking about the KFC in my fridge, empathizing with chickens for the first time probably in my entire life. And I realized something really important, which is that the values that I have and the morals that I say that I have and the way that I view myself as a person was actually not in alignment with what it was that I was choosing to do every single day. There's a weird contradiction, isn't there, where we live in a world, whether it's in Greece, whether it's in the UK where I'm from, or the US where I currently am, it seems that wherever we go in the world, people always seem to have similar values when it comes to animals. And what I mean by that is that almost everyone says that they're against things like animal cruelty, animal suffering, animal harm. You know, if you ask anyone on the street, do you think that animal cruelty is okay? 9 times out of 10, they're going to say no. But the contradiction is that even though the vast majority of people would say no to animal cruelty, those same people are paying every single day for a system or multiple systems that cause more suffering, more harm, and are more cruel to animals than any other on the planet. And when we think about what we have today, we have a system or systems of farming and systems of animal use, which cause more suffering to animals than ever in human history. And so the problem from an animal suffering perspective has never been as bad as it currently is, whilst at the same time, people all around the world will tell you, will tell everyone that they're against the very things that they pay for every single day. So in that moment, reading that story, thinking about the fried chicken in my fridge, this is what I recognize about myself. This is what I say, but this is what I do. And that doesn't line up. It doesn't match. So what do I do about it? So I went vegetarian, of course, at that point. And then I went vegan about 8 months later. And the reason I went vegan is because I saw this documentary called Earthlings, which is, for those of you who maybe have already seen it, is ultimately a difficult, upsetting, violent, objective depiction or showing of what happens to animals. It's filmed in the US, but most of it, if not pretty much all of it, is the same everywhere around the world. You know, the basic proponents, the basic elements of what makes Earthlings so awful is the same everywhere because it's what's happening to animals everywhere. Now, after the documentary had finished, I went and spent time with a hamster called Rupert. Now, growing up, I wasn't someone who was raised with pets. I didn't have a dog or a cat or any rabbits, no hamsters, no gerbils. I didn't have any animals in my life growing up. And it wasn't until I was 19 years old that I had the first animal that I actually ever had a connection with, that I met the first animal I ever had a connection with. Because for me, animals weren't beings that I really interacted with. And truth be told, the closest I ever got to animals normally was when I ate them and put them in my stomach. That was the closest relationship I ever had with animals, until, of course, I met Rupert the hamster. So I got Rupert when I was about 19 years old, and then about 18 months or so later is when I watched Earthlings. So the documentary finishes, and I decide to go spend some time with Rupert, because Rupert would always make me happy. And the film had made me not so happy. It made me very sad. I was upset. I was emotional. And so I thought, I'll go spend some time with Rupert. And so I've got Rupert the hamster, and he's on my hand, and he's doing Rupert the hamster things. And I give him some broccoli because Rupert the hamster loved broccoli. In fact, broccoli was Rupert the hamster's favorite food. He loved broccoli. If you ever gave Rupert the hamster broccoli, he was the happiest hamster who had ever lived. So happy. But Rupert didn't like kale, the vegetable kale. Nah, Rupert did not like kale. You see, he had likes and he had dislikes. Things that made him Rupert the hamster, right? And actually, there was something even more unique, more interesting about Rupert than his love for broccoli and his dislike for kale. When you think of a hamster, and you have an image of a hamster in your head, what's that hamster doing? Are they running on something? When I think of a hamster, I always think of a hamster wheel because the two go so seamlessly together. You know, hamsters run on hamster wheels, and they love to run. They run for ages and ages and ages. At least, well, that's what I was told. And that's what I thought. Because when I got Rupert, I also got him a wheel, a hamster wheel, of course, because hamsters love wheels. And I put the wheel in Rupert's home. And I put a little bit of food on the wheel to encourage Rupert to give it a go. And he did it once, maybe twice. But really, I only ever saw him doing it once. He went on the wheel, tried it a little bit, and then never did it again. Because Rupert the hamster was the laziest hamster who had ever lived. He was so lazy and so unlike every other hamster because he never ran in his wheel ever. And so I thought, what is this? What sort of hamster is Rupert? And I thought, you know what? If you won't run in his wheel, I'll get him a ball. Because if you don't want to put hamsters in wheels, you can get them balls and they'll run around the floor in these balls. And I thought that sounds lovely. Put a hamster in a ball, watch them run, entertainment for hours. So I got Rupert a ball. I put him in the ball. And every time I did that, he would sit in his ball. He would take all the food he'd been storing in his cheeks. He would eat it, and then he would go to sleep. And that's all he would ever do. Now, the reason I tell this story is not to try and shame Rupert for not exercising enough. It's more to say that Rupert the hamster was a very unique hamster. I could have bought another hamster from the pet shop the day I bought Rupert. And I could have spent the same amount of money, and I could have brought that hamster home, and I could have called that hamster Rupert. But that Rupert the hamster would not have been the same as the Rupert the hamster that I had. That Rupert the hamster might have loved running on his wheel, might have hated broccoli but loved kale. When we think about animals, we often don't consider them as being individuals. And this is one of the biggest problems that we face. It's one of the biggest reasons, I feel at least, that we continue doing what we do to certain animals, because we refuse to recognize them as being individuals with personalities, with things that make them the unique animals that they all individually are. Now, sometimes when we talk about what we do to animals, we will say things like, 85 billion land animals are killed for food every single year, and as many as 2.3 trillion marine animals are killed for food every single year. And the reason that we say those numbers is, of course, well, firstly, because they're true. Secondly, because they're shocking. And thirdly, because it shows just how big this problem is. But I think sometimes that can often, or something that can sometimes be often overlooked, is the fact that we're not talking about numbers or statistics or data. What we're fundamentally talking about are individuals. Because for every one of those 85 billion land animals and maybe up to 2.3 trillion marine animals are an individual, each one of those. And to me, that reinforces the problem that we have even more. Because to me, Rupert the hamster was this one individual animal in my life who brought me so much comfort, so much joy, so much happiness. He was just wonderful. He was with me for 3 years and it was a delight. And then I think about the fact that all around us every single day are individuals with personalities as funny, as unique, as entertaining, as remarkable as the personality that Rupert had, but contained within every single one of the pigs, chickens, lambs, ducks, turkeys, cows, salmon, tuna. Within all of these animals is an individual, a sentient conscious being who's having this, what we call a subjective experience. What I mean by that is, for all of us, our experience of this moment right now is unique to us. Every one of us is perceiving what's happening right now in this moment according to the way that we see the world and the position and place that we are in this world. We have our body and our life, and that is all that we have. But the same is true for the animals as well. And so for me, it's always really important to bring it back down to that notion of the individual, because for me, that's what caused me to recognize the immorality of not being vegan, the unethicalness of not being vegan, the harm that is caused when we choose to buy things that harm animals when we don't need to. And when we know doing so is a violation of the basic rights that we as vegans have come to realize that non-human animals deserve. So I went vegan. And like many of you who went vegan, I went vegan with this belief, I suppose, that everyone around me in my life would get it. That I would say that I was vegan and I would tell them the reasons why, and I'd explain much of the things that I've just said in the past 20 minutes or so. And all my friends and all my family and everyone I spoke to would get it. And then they didn't. And that hurt me greatly and confused me greatly. To me, then and now, it seems so obvious why we shouldn't cause unnecessary suffering and harm to animals when we can avoid it. It seems obvious that if we can choose to buy foods that reduce our environmental impact, then we should. It seems obvious to me that if we can choose to buy foods that reduce the risk of diseases and pandemics and viruses and antibiotic resistance, that we should. All of these things seem obvious to me. And yet to many others, they don't seem quite as obvious. And so then I got interested in trying to work out why. Why is it that something that from a more objective, rational position should be relatively easy to convince people of is actually one of the hardest things to convince people of? Now, the truth is that we as humans are very complex, aren't we? We have a very intelligent brain, but also a very flawed brain. We don't always see things as clearly as we should. We have biases and we can be misled and tricked, and we can fall for things that aren't necessarily true. And I think our relationship with certain species of animals is a perfect illustrator of that, because it shows the disharmony with our actions and our behaviors. It shows the contradiction with how we view certain animals compared to others. And so I started having lots of conversations with people, going to colleges and universities, going to farmers' auction markets, debating hunters, debating people in senior positions of farming organizations, having conversations with lots of different people, trying to work out what drove people to do what they do. And along the way, I've met some very interesting people, people who have surprised me, people who have delighted me, people who have saddened me, people who have frustrated me. But one thing that I've realized in all the conversations that I've had so far is that we're not all that different as humans, not all that different in terms of the reason why we do what we do. Culture, tradition, society, habit, because of peer pressure, social conformity, misinformation. What we have fundamentally is a problem that is seen all the world over, done by people from many different cultures and demographics and belief systems and religions and all of these different things that make us very different. But with this issue of what we do to animals, it seems that almost ubiquitously or universally, we have similar reasons for doing what we do. And the reason why I think that's an important thing to mention is that it's really simple to realize that whilst the challenge ahead of us may seem daunting, fundamentally, it doesn't need to seem as daunting as it may initially seem. Because what we have is more or less a group of people around the world who are not against the things that we as vegans are wanting to promote or support, but have just not been given the information in a way that's resonated with them as of yet. And so for me, the power that we have as vegans is that we have one of the simplest jobs in theory. We just have to show people and tell people the truth, help people realize that ethically speaking, their actions are not in alignment with the values that they say that they have. But now, of course, that's easier said than done, of course, but things are changing all around us. And that to me is a really important thing for us to recognize. Now, the reason I told you a little bit about my backstory is because each and every one of us has a backstory. Whether we're vegan or not, each and every one of us is in the moment that we are in right now because of a series of things that has happened to us from the very moment that we were born. Isn't that amazing? That from the moment we're born, things happen around us and influence us that will fundamentally determine who we become later in life. Now, the reason that I say that is because we as vegans can often feel like we have to say something or do something that turns someone vegan instantly. But that's not necessarily the case. If you're vegan in this room, think about why you're vegan. Now, for you guys, there may be something similar as there was for me. Maybe you watched a documentary, Earthlings. The Game Changers maybe inspired you to think about your health. Maybe Cowspiracy got you interested in the environment. Maybe you watched Dominion. Maybe you saw a documentary. Maybe you saw something online, an Instagram post or a YouTube post or whatever it may be. Maybe you had a conversation with a friend or family member. But when we think about it, that moment that pushed us to veganism probably wasn't the only thing that ever happened in our lives. Maybe you had a chicken truck crash story. Maybe you had a different moment in your life. I remember being very young and going fishing quite often. I mean, it was maybe once a year, twice a year, that kind of thing. So semi-often. I remember one time fishing, and it was in Scotland. And when I would go fishing, I wouldn't kill the animals myself. I was very young, 10 maybe at the time, maybe a little bit younger. And when I would go fishing with my family, we would never kill the fish ourselves. We would catch them and release them. And I really, really distinctly remember one time someone fishing next to me, pulling the fish out of the water, unhooking the fish, but not throwing the fish back in. Instead, they held the fish down and clubbed them to death. Now, that moment sticks out in my head because I found it to be so incredibly violent and so awful. Even from a young age, I recognized that. And even though I was fishing, I still thought that the brutality of the death was something that should be viewed very negatively. Now, that shaped how I viewed marine animals because I became interested in the oceans. I became interested in sharks, interested in whales. And as a consequence, I believe of that moment where I empathized with a fish for the first time properly in my life, I began to feel differently about marine animals in a way that I don't think I would have done if I'd not had that moment that was ingrained in my head. I became obsessed with shark movies. I liked watching films like Jaws or Deep Blue Sea. I liked the thrill of thinking that out there in the ocean were these huge, magnificent predators that were horrendous and scary and terrifying. And then one day I came across this film called Orca the Killer Whale. And this film was basically like Jaws, but with a killer whale instead of a great white shark. And this film was about a killer whale who was trying to kill this fisherman. This fisherman had actually killed the killer whale's mate and also their unborn calf. And so this killer whale had the vengeance to kill this fisherman. Anyway, I watched this film because I was like, oh, this will be great. Another predator in the ocean who can scare me. And so I watched that film, a fiction film, of course. And then I saw a trailer for a documentary called Blackfish. And the film Blackfish is about SeaWorld. And SeaWorld was infamous at that time because of a killer whale called Tilikum. And Tilikum had killed several of their trainers. And so I saw this trailer for this documentary called Blackfish and decided that I really wanted to see it because I thought it would scare me, like Jaws did, or like Orca the killer whale did. And I thought it would scare me because this was a real life moment. This was about a real animal who had killed humans. And I thought, wow, how scary will that be? And I went to see the film and I was scared. But I wasn't scared because of the killer whales. I was scared because of what we humans do to them. And I was scared because I realized that we are exploiting these magnificent animals and driving them insane in the way that we keep them captive, and the way that we harm them, the way that we make them perform tricks for us day in, day out, swimming around in these tiny swimming pools when they should be out in the ocean swimming for dozens of miles every single day. And we deprive them of that until the point where they lash out because they've gone so frustrated. They've become so bored, so insane from what we do to them. And that terrified me because I realized that we humans do awful things to animals. This was before the chicken truck crash story. The reason I say those things to you is to emphasize that beyond just the big moments in our life, there are these small moments that lead us up to the point where we eventually realize that we need to change. I want to read you out a quote to maybe wrap things up now. And the quote comes from a civil rights activist and an author, someone called James Baldwin. In fact, James Baldwin, they were a civil rights activist back in the 50s and 60s, I believe. And the quote is, "The world changes according to the way people see it. And if you can alter even by a millimeter the way people look at reality, then you can change the world." Now, the reason I like that quote so much is because it emphasizes that we need to not view the task in front of us as being this task that is huge in scale and maybe insurmountable, impossible to achieve. Instead, the task in front of us is merely about shifting things millimeter by millimeter. Think about the Earth. Underneath the surface of the Earth are what we call tectonic plates. The Earth is formed of these tectonic plates. Now, tectonic plates fundamentally change how the world looks, but they don't move great distances at a time. They move very small distances. They shift millimeter by millimeter. But when they do that, they create different worlds around us, different ecosystems around, different terrains around us. But that movement forms millimeter by millimeter. It's not some great monumental shift, but it changes how the world looks. And I suppose we can view ourselves and what we do in a similar way. We're shifting things millimeter by millimeter. That might not seem like a lot, and of course, we would wish it to be more. But even that small shift over time creates a different world around us. And so for me, that's an empowering thing to recognize, because every conversation we have, everything we share online, every vegan recipe we cook for non-vegan friends and family is this millimeter by millimeter process. And you don't know. You don't know if maybe that conversation you had with your partner a week ago, or someone on the street a month ago, or that post that you shared online last night. You don't know if for the person who saw that or listened to you, if that could be their blackfish moment, like it was for me, or the chicken truck crash story moment that I had, or the Earthlings moment that I had. We should never devalue what it is that we are achieving simply by living vegan ourselves, becoming vegan, and advocating for vegan. Because it is through these small changes, millimeter by millimeter, we will start to see real progress and hopefully one day change the Earth and the world to make it a better place for everyone, human and non-human alike. Thank you for listening. I hope that you enjoyed it. I really appreciate you giving me the time and for inviting me to be a part of the festival. And hopefully I can be there in person one day. I'd love an excuse to come to Greece, but I would also love an excuse to come eat some delicious vegan food with all of you in Greece as well. That's nice.
Thank you very much for being here.
Yeah.
Hopefully when you're back to Europe, we can see you in some Vegan Life Festival of Athens.
I would love that, more than you know. So let's make it happen.
Yeah, see you soon.